Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week here at the Things That Don't Change for the 15th week in Ordinary Time. We got 3 saints to go through today, so let's waste no time, get started here. The first saint that we have is Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, which apparently is pronounced in the Mohawk. It's pronounced Gaderi Degagwita, which I am going to completely fumble over, so bear with me with that. But anyway, she was born in the year 1656 in Acernin, which is near the modern town of Orisville, New York, which is off of the Mohawk River in upstate New York. She was born to a Mohawk chieftain and also to a woman who was a Christian Algonquin who was actually captured and assimilated into the Mohawk tribe. When she was 4 years old, a smallpox outbreak broke out in her village, and it was during the course of this that both of her parents and her brother were killed, by the illness. She survived, however, though she was, kind of scarred from being sick, and also just her eyesight was very poor for the rest of her days. And that's actually where she got her name. Degagwita actually means she who bumps into things in Mohawk. So that was kind of a name attributed to her for her poor eyesight. She was adopted by her paternal aunt, whose husband was a prominent figure in the Turtle clan of the Mohawk tribe. And in the year 1666, she moved to a village called Cognawaha. I have no idea how to spell any of these other Mohawk words, so I apologize. She moved to this village when her original village was destroyed by the French during some raids, some wars that were going on between the Mohawks and the French around this time. And it was during her childhood that she became very skilled at just beadwork and basket weaving. Just became very reliable, very well known for her handiwork around the village. At the age of 13, she was engaged to a boy to be married. That was kind of the standard Mohawk custom that the two young people would be kind of engaged around this age. However, she always wished to remain unmarried. So despite this, she continued to not be married throughout the rest of her life. So after the war between the Mohawks and the French ended, the Mohawks started allowing some Jesuits kind of into their settlements after the peace to kind of just instruct the people. And it was during this time that Degagwita, she was instructed into the Catholic faith when she turned 18 by Father Jacques de Lamberville, who was the Jesuit in her village at this time. And he recorded that she's a very mild-mannered young woman, very well-behaved, and also very holy. Which, of course, started to raise some concerns with other members of her tribe who didn't subscribe to the Christian faith. She was baptized on Easter Sunday in the year 1676 at St. Peter's Church, using water from a spring, which is the spring now it is on the site of her shrine in upstate New York. She took the name Catherine, or Kateri, in the Mohawk, in honor of St. Catherine of Siena. And several years later, she moved to the mission of St. Francis Xavier near Montreal, so she moved into Canada. She made her first communion on Christmas in the year 1677. And then in 1679, she made a vow of perpetual virginity on the Feast of the Annunciation. However, this wasn't officially before the bishop, so technically it wasn't like an official vow, but this was something that she did hold to for the rest of her life. She observed Iroquois aesthetical practices, although some of her spiritual directors were a little skeptical of that, just because her health was not in a great way. It wasn't necessarily something necessary for the Christian life. However, she really felt called to kind of continue in these practices, in a way of fasting and kind of an abstinence. She's recorded as saying that she will willingly abandon this miserable body to hunger and suffering, provided that my soul may have its ordinary nourishment. So basically just kind of relying on the grace of God to support her amidst these practices. She became friends with a woman, Marie-Thérèse Tekakwitha, who was, a fellow native woman herself, also converted to Christianity. And it was between these two, they started to kind of come up with the idea that maybe there was some kind of native religious order that they felt called to found. However, this request was denied by the Jesuits around this time. In the year 1680, on April the 17th, her health failed and she passed away. She was only about 23 or 24 at this time. And her last words were recorded to be, "Jesus, Mary, I love you." So after her death, there were many reports of her apparition to both her friend Marie-Thérèse, also another mentor of hers, and a missionary priest who she knew. And over the next 4 years, pilgrimages to her tomb began to produce, countless healing miracles. There was in the years since, there's a bit of controversy in the literature about exactly how the native Mohawk people felt about her and kind of about her journey and her conversion to the faith. Some say they were a little more hostile. Others say that they were a little more favorable. They were a little more tolerant of it. But either way, she's always kind of been seen as a figure to kind of bridge that gap between the natives and the Europeans. She was declared the protectoress of Canada and beatified by Pope St. John Paul II in the year 1980, and then finally canonized by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012. And her feast day is on July the 14th. The next saint that we have is Saint Bonaventure. So Saint Bonaventure was born in the year 1221 in Bagno Reggio, which is near Viterbo in Italy. And his birth name was actually Giovanni. However, at some time in his early years, this was changed to Bonaventure. People aren't exactly sure why the name was changed. Some are credited to Saint Francis of Assisi. We don't know much about the early life of Saint Bonaventure in general. However, there is an episode that people discuss where Saint Francis of Assisi, who died a couple years after Saint Bonaventure was born, but as a young boy, Giovanni Bonaventure was brought to Saint Francis because he was ill with like this very serious illness, and St. Francis actually miraculously cured him. So, going on from this moment, St. Bonaventure just always felt this great call with the Franciscans. Around the years 1238, 1240, somewhere in there, he joined the Orders of Friar Minor, the Franciscans. And he was sent to the University of Paris to complete his studies around 1242. And it was here that he studied under a Franciscan named Alexander of Hales, who's the man who kind of founded the Franciscan School of the University of Paris. So kind of, this specific branch of the college that catered to the Franciscan spirituality. So Bonaventure received the licentiate, which allowed him to teach kind of publicly at the university, which he continued to do from that time until around the year 1256. And it was around that time that he was actually forced to stop teaching when a bit of a controversy erupted over kind of who should have more priority, the secular teachers, kind of the priests who weren't order priests, or the priests of the Mendicant orders, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans. So there's a bit of controversy as to, who kind of had priority there. There was a lot of polemics involved, a lot of people kind of, writing treatises against the other side. A lot of people going after the Franciscans for this. Bonaventure wrote a paper called De Paparate Christi to kind of respond to some of these criticisms, towards the Franciscans. And the orders did eventually win out in this controversy, in that they were kind of allowed to continue their positions. In the year 1257, St. Bonaventure received his doctorate, and he is said to have received it with a good friend of his, and also, kind of a friendly rival of his, named Thomas Aquinas, who, went to school and taught at the University of Paris around the same time. In the year 1257, he was chosen as the new Minister General of the Franciscans. So basically, that's the head honcho, the guy who runs the Franciscan order. He was only 36 years old at the time. However, he was, seen for his great teaching ability and his great holiness, that, he was the right man to lead the Franciscans. So there were a lot of internal disputes kind of plaguing the Franciscan order around this time that he was, that Bonaventure was suddenly required to address. And specifically, this was between two separate camps of Franciscans. On one side, you had what was called the Spirituales, who emphasized just very strict literal observance to the rule of St. Francis. On the other side, you had what was known as the Relaxati, which, advocated for some more innovations, maybe, some changes to kind of the practices, as time went on. And both sides were known for very extreme views. You had the more reasonable center, but then also on the fringes of the movements, the spirituales, the spiritualists, they kind of fell in with certain heresies, which discussed that kind of the law of Christ was kind of superseded now by what they called the law of the Holy Spirit. So kind of this idea that, the two members of the Trinity, kind of there's some differentiation there, or some conflict between the two, which of course the church doesn't believe. These views were condemned. And then also on the other side, the Relaxati were just known to be very lax, in their innovation. And there's a lot of reform needed in that movement too. So Bonaventure, trying to kind of bring both sides together, had a bunch of reforms kind of codified and promulgated at what was called the General Chapter of Narbonne in the year 1260. This was kind of a council of sorts amongst the Franciscans, where they devised these changes and these amendments to the order to kind of make it more friendly for both sides, make everybody kind of agree going forward. It was also during this general chapter in Narbonne that Bonaventure was tasked with writing a life of St. Francis, so kind of like a biography of St. Francis himself. This biography was approved in 1263 as kind of the official biography of St. Francis. Pope Clement IV asked Bonaventure to become Archbishop of York, that's in England, in 1265. However, Bonaventure refused this position because he was kind of content where he was. He continued to work closely with the Pope, however, and after Pope Clement passed away, he had a kind of an important role in trying to help the man who eventually became Pope Gregory X get elected in 1271. In the year 1273, he was asked to become Cardinal Bishop of Albano in Italy, and he didn't want this position either, but did accept this time. He did continue to be Minister General of the Franciscans for another year until 1274, and it was at this point that, then he was then replaced by another Franciscan named Jerome of Ascoli, who later became Pope Nicholas IV. Gregory X asked Bonaventure to prepare documentation for the Second Council of Lyon, which he was preparing in 1274. And it was during this council, amongst other things, that that reunion between East and West was there was an attempt to achieve that. And there actually was an agreement between the two sides, which Bonaventure kind of helped prepare, which was accepted around July 6th. Unfortunately, in the intervening years, that kind of fell apart a bit. However, while he was involved here a couple of days after this agreement was agreed to at the council, Bonaventure passed away on July 15th in 1274. The council was still in session. However, he passed away. The cause of his death is a bit unknown. We're not really sure why. Some earlier documentation say that he may have been poisoned. For what purposes or by who is kind of unclear. But that's kind of something that's kind of always been a bit of a rumor, I guess. And this is actually just after St. Thomas Aquinas himself passed away. Obviously his good friend Thomas Aquinas was also called by the Pope to be involved with the Council of Lyon. However, on his way to the council, he got sick and passed away. So he actually never made it to the council. So these two great saints, these two great friends, both died within a couple of months of each other. Saint Bonaventure was buried in Lyon in France. And in 1434, his body was moved to a different church, and it was during this time that his head was actually found to be incorrupt. So, his body had started to decay, however, his head was still intact. And his body was actually burned in the year 1562 by the Huguenots. These were a group of kind of Calvinistic Protestants, which were very popular in France around this time after the Reformation. And they kind of burned the relics, the body of Saint Bonaventure, except his head, which was saved by a priest who managed to, kind of get it and sequester it away. And this, head continued to be something of veneration until it was then lost during the French Revolution, and no one really knows where it ended up. He was canonized in the year 1482 by Pope Sixtus IV, and then was declared Doctor of the Church in the year 1588 by Pope Sixtus V. And he was given the title of Sephardic Doctor. Each Doctor of the Church kind of has a specific title that they have. St. Thomas Aquinas is the Angelic Doctor, so St. Bonaventure is the Sephardic Doctor. And his feast day is on July the 15th. Now, the final saint that we have today is St. Camillus de Lellis. So St. Camillus was born in the year 1550 in Buccianico, which is in the region of Abruzzo in southern Italy. And he was the son of a military officer and a mother who died when he was very young. So, he kind of knew his father more and didn't really know his mother very well. However, he was neglected as a child. His father didn't really pay a lot of attention to him. So he grew up kind of very lost, kind of searching for his path. So he became a soldier in his own right as he grew up, serving in both the armies of Venice and also of Naples. And it was actually this latter army which he served in until it was disbanded in 1574. And, there was many times throughout his life that he ended up going broke just, from losing all his money to gambling. He was somewhat always kind of attached to religion, despite the fact that he had this great vice. And he met with a Franciscan friar at one point who just was very kind to him, and he was very struck by this. So he did attempt to apply to the Franciscans. However, he was rejected, most likely due to his attachments to sins such as gambling. He arrived in Rome and started seeking medical attention for his feet, which over the years had become kind of just very kind of swollen and just had a lot of chronic pain in them. And it was during his time in this hospital that he was actually dismissed. He was kind of kicked out because of his, quarrelsome disposition and also just his still lingering passion for gambling. So, kind of back on the road again, he became a soldier for Venice for the second time, this time helping to fight off the Turks in a war that occurred in 1569. He worked with the Capuchin order at the town of Manfredonia in Italy to assist in the construction of a new building that they were building on the campus of their monastery. And it was while here speaking to a member of this convent that he actually finally kind of just became convicted to renounce his gambling addiction, and just by the grace of God was able to free himself from this vice. He served as a lay brother for a time with the Capuchins before he was dismissed here due to his infirmity. He was still really having a lot of trouble getting around with his legs and his feet. So he ended up back in Rome at the same hospital which he had gotten kicked out from several years before. However, this time, they did not kick him out because he had become a changed man, became known for his great piety and prudence, and eventually kind of became a kind of a nurse of sorts in his own right, and then eventually from here became the kind of director of that hospital. He felt just a great call to a medical vocation during this time. So he attempted to found a lay order of kind of nurses and kind of people to care for the sick. However, this was opposed by some. So kind of running into these roadblocks, not sure what to do. He consulted some of his friends and his spiritual director, who was none other than Saint Philip Neri, to kind of figure out what to do next. And between talks with them and kind of where he felt called, he became determined to become a priest. So he studied at the Jesuit college in Rome, eventually becoming ordained to the priesthood. He founded an order known as the Fathers of a Good Death in 1584. And the vows of this order included, devotion to the plague-stricken, both in hospitals and also for those who couldn't get to a hospital, making house calls and coming to their homes to minister to them. He established a house of this order in Naples 2 years later, and it was in Naples that two of the community died as what they called martyrs of charity, for tending to the sick, the plague-ridden on a ship that had been quarantined off the coast. So, that the ship that was coming into the port of Naples was prevented from landing because there was a plague outbreak on board. No one wanted to go out there and tend to them. So two of these martyrs, martyrs of charity, as they called them, two of these members of Camillus's order decided to kind of brave it, go out and tend to the sick, and they died as a result of that. While ministering to these poor ill sailors. So the Fathers of a Good Death became a full mendicant order in 1591 by the order of Pope Gregory XIV. And Camillus continued to suffer throughout his life from his foot ailment and had a lot of trouble getting around, but again, was very determined and didn't complain much and just was as active as he possibly could be. He had a lot of other health issues that started to come up too. However, he continued to work through those. However, finally, his health started to take a turn. And on July 14th of the year 1614, he passed away at the age of 63. He had founded many houses over the years of his order all around Italy. So they became kind of a very very well-known order. He was buried at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Rome, and Camillus was beatified in 1742 by Pope Benedict XIV, and then canonized in 1746 by the same Pope Benedict XIV. And his feast day is on July the 18th. That's all we have for today. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I hope that you all have a very blessed week.